Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. This is your guide to flavoring. When it comes to flavoring your kombucha during the second fermentation phase, the options are pretty much limitless. You can flavor with store-bought juices, juice concentrate, frozen berries, fresh berries, pureed fruit. You can use cut-up fruit, dried fruit. I've even heard that some people use jam. You can even use fresh or dried herbs to add that extra dimension to your flavors too. Like I said, the options are pretty much endless here. As a general rule, I like to use about 1/4 cup to maybe around 1/3 cup of flavoring per 16-ounce bottle. If I'm using a 12-ounce bottle, I use a little bit less. It doesn't need to be super precise, and it really depends on how flavorful your flavoring actually is. For instance, if you're buying frozen apple juice concentrate from the store, you won't need to use quite as much of that concentrate as if you were using freshly juiced apples. The more sugar that's in the bottle, the more carbonated it can get. I tend to prefer to use fruit purees and juices myself, only because during that second fermentation process, the yeasts really need an extra kick of sugar to get them going again, and so that they can eat something and convert it into carbon dioxide. I happen to like my kombucha really fizzy, and so I want to make it as easy as possible for the yeast to access that sugar. If I was using fruit pieces instead of fruit purees, the yeast would have to do a little bit of extra work to get that sugar and extract it from that piece of fruit instead of extracting it from the smaller molecules of the juice or puree. There are a lot of people that say they have difficulty getting good carbonation during their second fermentation phases in the bottle, and I suspect that it might be because they're not using enough sugar to give the yeast something to feed during that process. I tested out a bottle of just plain unflavored kombucha myself. I second fermented it for a few days at room temperature, and then I chilled it and opened it, and it was completely flat. So it really does matter that you add an extra kick of sugar through the flavoring during that second fermentation process if you want to get nice carbonation. The fresher the fruit and the more pulp there is in the fruit flavoring that you use, the more likely that you'll see a scoby form in your bottle. For instance, this is some cherries that I pureed in the blender and I added into my kombucha as the flavoring. And you can see that there's a lot of cherry pulp that's kind of settled at the bottom and at the top of the vessel. That's totally okay. That's just a sign that your second fermentation is going well and that the yeasts are breaking down the fruit even further. If you don't like the pulp, or if there's just too much pulp in the bottle, you can go ahead and strain it out, no problem. But if you like the pulp, you can drink it, and that's totally fine too. On the flip side, if you're using store-bought juice that's been pasteurized or from concentrate, you might not get as big of a scoby as if you were using fresh juice, and it might actually take a little bit longer during that second fermentation phase for that carbonation to build up. The sweeter the fruit, the more carbonation will build up, and the faster the carbonation will build up. So for example, pineapple has been super fizzy for me, same with watermelon and a lot of really, really sweet fruit. If you find that the fruit that you're using is on the sour side or it's not as sweet as you think it should be, you can always add a little bit of sugar to your flavoring to help bump up that sweetness. And if you're concerned about sugar content, remember that a lot of that sugar will get eaten up by the yeast, so there won't be a ton of sugar left in the remaining product that you're actually drinking. If you want your kombucha to be on the more acidic side, then go ahead and let it first ferment longer before you bottle it and add your fruit flavoring. Just remember that whatever you flavor with will likely have some sugar that will also get eaten away during the second fermentation process. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. You're just gonna need to find a first fermentation duration and a second fermentation duration that works best for you depending on your taste preferences. Now, if you don't want to add any flavorings to your kombucha and you want to just drink it straight after the first fermentation phase, that's totally okay too. If you want to build up carbonation in your plain kombucha, just add about a teaspoon of sugar per 16-ounce bottle and let that plain kombucha ferment in a sealed bottle for another 3 to 4 days before moving it to the refrigerator to test the carbonation. And likewise, if you're bottling a flavor that doesn't have a ton of sugar, like lemon ginger for instance, then you can go ahead and add a little bit of sugar to that as well to use as priming sugar that the yeasts can eat and convert into carbon dioxide. So it's definitely a balancing act, but this is honestly my most favorite part of kombucha homebrewing. Just the variety of flavor combinations you can go with are endless, and you can oftentimes make a lot of flavors that they don't sell at the store. I made a tangerine rosemary one that was divine, and here I have plum, pineapple passion fruit, watermelon, and cherry, all using fruits that are locally sourced and in season. So I highly recommend that you look into what fruits and flavor combos you like. Happy brewing!